This is one of the most famous Agave utahensis plants in the world, and I think someone cut the stalk to poach the seeds. Not all wild collection is poaching. Some of it is actually completely legal, and that's the problem. I just wrote an article for the Cactus and Succulent Society of America Journal about the ethics of wild collection versus poaching in Agave utahensis, and how to tell if an Agave utahensis plant has been dug up from the wild, if it's actually been seed grown. And that's out now, so definitely go check that out. This is what normal Agave utahensis habitat looks like, and this is what Agave utahensis plants look like normally when they're in the ground. But sometimes I find these plants seemingly still green, seemingly recently still alive, that have been removed from the soil. Most of what I find isn't poaching. I think it's probably the wind blowing rosettes out of the ground, burrowing animals, that sort of thing. But this one I can't exactly explain away. This is probably the most famous Agave utahensis subspecies Euborospina in habitat. In fact, if you're on Instagram, if you follow me or any other really agave influencer, probably in the United States, you've seen this agave plant before, the specific plant. It's famous because it's got what's called merged spines. That's where the terminal spine kind of merges into the first few lateral teeth, creating a marginate white edge around the tip of each leaf. And plants with this characteristic can sell for a ton online. And so a lot of places that used to be full of plants with this merged characteristic, in fact, have very few of them anymore. Normally when Agave utahensis stalks are bitten by grazing animals, they're bitten a few feet off the ground where the stalk is still tender and easy to chew. This plant, on the other hand, looks different. Generally, when animals bite an Agave utahensis stalk, they don't bite it, they don't make a clean cut down low, so close to the sharp spines where the stalk is probably pretty woody and hard to chew. Now, I can't prove that this was cut by a human hand, but I still can't shake the feeling that it was, and I've never really seen anything else like it. This is a very popular and well-known retail nursery selling plants that have been dug up from the wild, and a lot of them, I think, come from this place, actually, which you're seeing photos of right now, which I have confirmed with the relevant state agencies, is a totally legal wild collection operation. These plants have been dug up from the wild. And let me be clear, I do not think they were poached. Remember, poaching is a crime. Wild collection is simply the act of digging up plants from habitat, whether that be legal or not legal. And I do believe these plants are, in fact, legal, and that may be the challenge we're facing here when it comes to protecting Agave utahensis, at least in southern Nevada here. And I talk a bit more about this in the CSSA Journal article, but I think, one of the key points in the article, and I hope the article does a good job of explaining why this is so important, is a difference between, legality in terms of having done the paperwork such that an Agave utahensis plant that's been dug up from the wild is legal, versus, poaching, or, which everybody agrees is a problem. It is possible for agave collection to be unsustainable, even if it's legal. That's been shown with other agave species, particularly in Mexico, that are used for mezcal. And there is, unfortunately, very little protection for Agave utahensis here in southern Nevada, where so many of them grow. Because there are no legal protections like tagging or tracking requirements for Agave utahensis here in southern Nevada, it can actually be really difficult to tell where a specific wild collected Agave utahensis plant came from and whether or not that plant was collected ethically and sustainably. In the journal article I just wrote, and actually here's the hard copy of it, and check it out. My photos on the back cover, which is super duper exciting. But go check out the hard copy if you're a member of the Cactus and Succulent Society of America. And if not, there's a link in the description to this video to where you can go read the full article online for free. But definitely join the society and read the journal. It's super cool. But in the journal article, I actually talk about how there's this controversial luxury housing development that's it's going ahead after decades of fights against it. And that's actually where I believe a lot of the agave utahensis from that legal wild collection operation are coming from. So I'm out here at that controversial housing development, luxury housing development, and not controversial, very long-standing mine that I wrote about in my CSSA Journal article, where I believe most of the legally wild collected Agave utahensis on the domestic and international markets is actually coming from. I'm actually standing on the public land that directly abuts the private land that the development is on, and there's a road behind me, which you can see at some point was graded and leveled so that the trucks, which are currently, as of this morning, running up and down it, doing work, could use it. And I don't know if you can see it around me, but all around me there are a ton of Agave utahensis plants. There's a bunch of Cylindra puntia and Opuntia and Pharaoh cactus and Joshua trees and a bunch of things, but a ton of what I'd call regular, degular Agave utahensis. And down this hillside is a bunch of utahensis, and then up that hillside is what's been worked on. So it makes sense that there would have been Agave utahensis on that hillside, probably in the same density that there is on this hillside. And so if they were dug up, then at least in this specific case, if they came from this hillside, I can confirm that they probably would have just been plowed under by whatever machine was used to grade this road here. According to satellite images, that construction road has existed for decades. So I don't think any of the Agave utahensis currently on the market came from specifically plants that were rescued from that area. But the private land there that's being developed is really, really big. And there's a bunch of land just like that where there's probably Agave utahensis that isn't right up next to public land, so I wasn't able to visit it. But because there is no legal protection in Southern Nevada for Agave utahensis, no tagging or tracking requirements, it's really difficult to tell if that's the kind of place that Agave utahensis plant came from. And actually, in the journal article, and remember, link in the description to go read the full thing online for free. But I talk about how there's a really popular retail nursery that sells a lot of wild collected plants, and the wild collection operation owner, who's a separate person from the retail operation folks, says that he supplies the retail side. The retail people have a whole bunch of different stories. Gave me a whole bunch of three different stories, something like that. I talk about it in the article. But again, because there's no protections, there's no transparency about where any of these Agave utahensis plants came from. So while I don't think they're necessarily illegal, I don't think they're poached, right, in that sense of the word, there is no guarantee that they were collected sustainably, ethically, all that kind of stuff. And so I think I was able to do the legwork, right? I was able to go out and visit the site right, near where the plants are probably being dug. I was able to go meet the collection operations owner. I was able to, to talk to the Department of Forestry. The average consumer, that stuff's basically going to be impossible. And so for the average collector, I think the answer is, if you only want to have ethically and sustainably grown Agave utahensis plants, you really need to stick to only seed grown. So I previously released a much more in-depth video about how to tell if a plant's been grown from seed, if an Agave utahensis plant has been grown from seed, or if it's been dug up from the wild. But just to give you a kind of a quick overview, there's basically 4 visual characteristics we can look at, and then 1 red flag. And I detail these again in that my new CSSA Journal article. The first one is roots. In habitat Agave utahensis, it grows out here in the desert where there's not a whole lot of moisture, and so it creates a really large fibrous root system that spreads out laterally across the surface of the soil to grab whatever moisture it can. When folks are digging plants up from the wild, they don't really have the time or the ability to extract all those roots intact, so they kind of chop up all the roots. So if you see a plant and it's pretty big and it's got a really severely pruned root system, that's a really good red flag that it's been dug up from the habitat, or at least grown in a field for a long time and then cut up right before it was sent to you. Versus seed-grown plants that have been grown in a container will generally have a sort of big ball of fibrous roots. A lot of times it will have conformed to the shape of the container they're in. And speaking of shape, the shape of the rosette is another really big indicator that a plant has been dug up from the wild versus if it's been seed grown. In habitat, there is a ton of UV stress. We're up here at probably like 6,000 feet right now in Agave utahensis habitat. And so there's a ton of UV stress that these plants get. So in habitat, the plants grow really upright and compact and sort of ball shaped, right? To expose less of their leaf surface to UV stress. In cultivation, on the other hand, generally light is controlled so as not to burn the plant. And so you get these much more open rosettes that expose much more of the leaf surface to the light that they are getting in cultivation. So if you see a plant, on the internet, and it's got this really tight ball shape with really compact rosette, with a lot of leaves pointing up, that's a red flag that the plant may have been dug up from habitat versus being seed grown. And another red flag, the third red flag here, is yellowed leaves. In habitat, there's not a lot of moisture. Some years there is, and so the plants will often develop a ring or two of yellow dead leaves on the outside of the rosette. In cultivation, you don't see that as often because the plants are generally taken really good care of and either pruned or just watered regularly, so as they never really develop, a lot of times at least, that ring of yellow leaves. So if you see a plant for sale, it's mature, it's got a bunch of yellow leaves on the outside, that is a really good indicator that it's been dug up from the wild, or at least super duper hard grown if it is actually seed grown. And then the fourth red flag is age. Agave utahensis grows really, really slow. A big mature plant is decades, at least 10 years, maybe 20 years or longer older. And so if the seller you're looking at, the vendor that you're buying from, hasn't been growing these plants, essentially farming these plants for a decade or more, and they're selling a whole bunch of them, you kind of got to ask yourself, where are they getting these plants? Are they actually growing them from seed, or are they just digging them up from the wild? These plants are 2 years old, 3 years old, somewhere in that range, and they're still really, really small. So the fourth red flag is age of the plant. If you see a vendor selling a whole bunch of really old plants and the vendor themselves aren't super old and established, then you got to kind of wonder where those plants are coming from if they're not being dug up from the wild. Plus, there's this fifth red flag that isn't exactly a visual characteristic of the plant itself to tell whether or not it's been dug up from the wild, but it is a good idea, a good way to understand the truthfulness or the knowledge level of the seller. And I've written about this before, and I've done a video about this before as well that goes in much more detail. But basically, Agave utahensis eborospina, because it's got really long spines, is the one that everybody wants to buy on the internet. And so sellers will sometimes list, either accidentally or on purpose, plants that are not eborospina as eborospina so they can sell them for more money. And what that means basically is that they're lying about the length of the spines, because there's very clearly a definition in the literature, and again, I've talked about this before, that Agave utahensis eborospina has spines at least 4 inches long, and there are tons of sellers online that are selling Agave utahensis plants that do not have terminal spines that are 4 inches long. So if a seller is willing to either lie to you or is misinformed enough about their plants that they are selling plants that are not eborospina as eborospina, you got to kind of wonder about the sourcing of the rest of their plants. And again, I've done videos going into all that into much more detail, and the article in the CSSA Journal also goes into all those things in more detail as well. There are 3 main threats facing Agave utahensis in habitat today, here, at least here near where I live in southern Nevada. The first one is that climate is compressing their habitat. They live up here in Sky Islands where it's 10 to 15 degrees at least cooler than down on the valley floor where it's the desert, and they can't survive in temperatures down there. They also get a lot more precipitation up here, and so that means that as the temperatures rise, the elevation which they'll be able to live will continue to shrink because more and more of their habitat will be getting warmer and warmer. There's also the threat of human development. There's land right over there that actually some Agave utahensis are being dug up from legally and rescued from development that is controversial or whatever, but it is actually happening. And so that development, that human development, is another squeeze on Agave utahensis here in habitat. And then there are market pressures, of course, with very little legal protection. There are certain, particularly around certain characteristics, and like Agave utahensis eborospina with really wavy or merged spines, they go for a lot especially in the international market on the internet. And so there is a ton of market pressure for people to come and poach potentially, really distinct individuals or the genetics of those individuals. And there's very little legal protection here, at least. So in the CSSA Journal article, I actually proposed some things that could be done to protect Agave utahensis here in southern Nevada and domestically and internationally. But that's going to require quite a bit of work. So again, check out that article and let's get talking about how we can get that stuff happening.